G'day, mate. This is the Do and Teach Guy podcast. So veg out and let's give it a bash. This is episode 20, and today I'm talking about how God's laws represent his nature and how they apply to all people throughout all of time, not just that short block between Moses and Jesus. Obviously, no one argues that the law was not in effect after Mount Sinai to the time of Jesus. The last 3 episodes we explored who the Bible says the law of God applies to after Jesus died. But now it's time to explore what the Bible has to say about the law outside of those times, and its relevance for all of human history. Law before Moses. First of all, let's look at a bunch of references in Genesis that show that there was the same law from the beginning as after the law was given. Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. This is the establishment of the Sabbath, with its 2 main rules. It must be the 7th day, and don't do any work on it. Next is a long one. Genesis 4 verses 3 to 11, but we'll start with 3 to 5. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So in this short section, it covers that sacrifices are needed, which comes from Exodus 20 verse 24. Then, what type of sacrifices are acceptable? From Leviticus 22 verses 20 to 21. The thing about the firstborn is repeated in Exodus 13 verse 2, and the part about the fat is from Leviticus 3 verse 16. Next, verse 6 and 7. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." The Bible's definition of sin in several places is transgression of the law. So here, sin is mentioned. So there must have been at least some of the laws given to these early people. Verses 8 to 11. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Here it is clear, by Cain being punished for murder, that murder was still a sin, which is confirmed later on in Exodus 20 verse 13, the classic "You shall not murder." Moving on to Genesis 7 verse 2 in the Noah story. "You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female." Here, Noah clearly knows what the difference was between clean and unclean animals. What's that? He only knew because of the quantity of groups that showed up? So, if there were 7 of one type of animal, they were clean? Good theory, but no. A little later, in Genesis 8, verse 20, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal, and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." So Noah knew what could be sacrificed and what couldn't, because only clean animals can be sacrificed. But if Noah only knew what was clean by their numbers, how did he know which birds to sacrifice? Noah sacrificed the clean birds and not the unclean ones. However, there were 7 of every bird, not just 7 of the clean ones. So you know, the clean and unclean laws are from Leviticus 11. Moving on, Genesis 9 verse 6. "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man." This is the early signs of the murder laws again, but this time we see that the penalty is given. Namely, you kill, you get killed, like in Exodus 21, verses 12 to 13. "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee." I read verse 13 to explain one of my theories. So back in Genesis 4, when Cain killed Abel, it says that Cain was talking to Abel in the field. Not arguing or anything, just talking. So I reckon that when Cain killed Abel, it wasn't premeditated. He just became a little too annoyed at the whole sacrifice thing, and in the spur of the moment he hit him over the head with a rock. Therefore, the death penalty doesn't necessarily apply to him, but the city of refuge thing would have been alright, which is found in Numbers 35. Moving on to a few chapters later, Genesis 17 verses 10 and 11. "This is my covenant which you shall keep, between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." This is part of the law given to Moses from Exodus 19 verse 5 about keeping God's covenant, and the circumcision laws in Leviticus 12 verse 3. However, this, like a few commandments, doesn't really show God's character, but is meant as a reminder for the people to remember that they are God's people, and to help them remember the laws. These verses also obviously only apply to men, and in my opinion, is to help blokes to remember to stay away from sexual immorality, the easiest sin that they fall into. Another of these reminder commandments is to wear tassels with the blue thread to help you remember God's instructions throughout the day every time you look at them. But that is a whole nother topic. Next, Genesis 18 verse 19. "For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." This verse doesn't show a specific commandment. However, it says to keep the ways of the Lord, implying that his ways have been told to them. You can't exactly expect someone to be righteous if they don't know the things that make you righteous. Genesis 19 verses 5 to 7. "And they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. How did they know that homosexuality was wicked if the law was not told to them yet? Last one, Genesis 26, verse 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. How can Abraham obey God's charges, commands, statutes, and laws if they won't be told to the people for hundreds of years after he dies? There are a few instances in Exodus before the people get to Mount Sinai, but they are mostly about Moses wanting to sacrifice things, which was already covered. Summary. All of God's laws were written down by God on tablets of stone at Mount Sinai, but before that, it seems that they were told to the people verbally, possibly told directly to Adam and Eve just after they found out what sin was. Then they may have passed that knowledge down to their kids, and their kids told their kids, and so on. The alternative is that God spoke directly to his prophets, or seers as they were called at that time, and they would tell the people. I would say that the list of rules given before Mount Sinai were not the entire lot, because a lot of the commandments are given to clarify details about other basic commandments. Like that time that the family of sisters, who had no male heirs, wanted their land to stay with them, so Moses sought God to clarify what was fair. That's from Numbers 27, if anyone cares. Anyway, like I said before, the two greatest commandments are to love God and love others. This is clarified more by defining how to love God and love others by the 10 Commandments. These are then further clarified by the rest of the commandments. Also, a bunch of the commandments were added in when mankind kept on finding new ways to be evil. So more rules were added to help them understand how God's nature is better represented. Not because those principles didn't exist before, it's probably just a case that God was telling them the minimum they needed to know until they went too far with some evil plan. Skipping forward, after thousands of years of this, mankind still didn't get it. So God finally had to come down himself in the form of a man to demonstrate on how these laws are meant to be kept and how to fully represent God's nature to both God and others. Jesus is our perfect example on how to live. A modern objection of this whole premise is that the law was only for the Jews. Clearly, the law was established before Moses got it in writing, so it's hard to say that the law was only for the Jews, since, first of all, the law at Mount Sinai was given to all of Israel and not just the Jews, which only made up 1/12 of them. But on top of that, Noah, Adam, and Cain, who knew the law, were all before Israel was even a thing. God's nature. The laws given to mankind are not just something that God made up on a whim. They are laws that represent his own nature, a nature of love and justice. All of the laws are there to show us how God wants to be loved, and how we should love one another like he loves us. So it only makes sense that the law is always in effect, from creation to the new creation, and on through eternity. Since the Bible clearly says that God never changes, why would his laws change that represent his unchanging nature? Hebrews 13 verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And Malachi 3 verse 6. For I am the Lord, I do not change. Therefore you are not consumed, O son of Jacob. There's also a bunch of other verses that show that God doesn't change, but you get the point. Law after return. Moving on to the law's relevance during and after the Millennium. After this supposed mythological church age, which the dispensationalists are so fond of, in the Millennium, the law that was meant to be done away with somehow makes a return. But the obvious conclusion would be that the law was never done away with for 2 of the 7,000 years of life on earth, but was, is, and will be for everyone for all time. The following are instances in the Old Testament that are talking about the Millennium that show that God's law will be in effect at that time. Isaiah 51 verses 6 and 7. Lift up your eyes to the heavens, and look on the earth beneath. For the heavens will vanish away like smoke. The earth will grow old like a garment, and those who dwell in it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished. Listen to me, you who know righteousness. You people in whose heart is my law, do not fear the reproach of men, nor be afraid of their insults. I think this verse is talking about the new creation, and not the Millennium, but I left it in to show that the law will be important even in the new creation, because the law is a representation of God's character. Anyway, this verse says only the righteous with God's law in their hearts will be part of the new creation. So it's only natural that the law will stay in effect, but the sin part will not be a thing anymore, which is kind of the bulk of the law, telling us how not to sin. Ezekiel 40 to 46 detail about the Millennium Temple, but that would take forever to read, so you can look that up for yourself. But effectively, in the Millennium, there will be another temple, and all the sacrifices and offerings will be done again, even the sin offerings. But before you complain that doing sin offerings cancels out Jesus' death, these are to memorialize the occasion, not to replace it. Also, like the sin sacrifices in the Old Testament, those sacrifices did not take away sin, but they were a placeholder to represent the future sacrifice of the perfect Jesus. This is clearly stated in Hebrews 10 verse 4. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Moving on, Micah 4 verse 2. Many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. This passage is referring to the millennial reign, where people will flock to Jerusalem to learn the law of God. However, I think that people physically going to the mountain is a metaphor, since the people from around the world will probably still have something like TV or the internet to watch and learn God's law without having to physically go to Jerusalem. The point is that they will be seeking after God's law. And the last one, Zechariah 14 verse 16. And it came to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This clearly shows that in the Millennium, the Feast of Tabernacles will be celebrated. It goes on to say that if the people don't celebrate it, then there'll be no rain on their land. So effectively, there'll be a governmental mandated holiday, with penalties for not participating. But then again, I don't know if people from around the world will physically have to go there. There could be something like sanctioned temples scattered all over the world that people can go to, because everyone in the whole world going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in one town or one city doesn't sound like there'll be enough room. Also, the no rain might be a metaphor too, since it was given to a farming culture. No rain meant no harvest, which meant no money. So it could be something more like a fine that they have to pay instead of it not raining on their land, since no rain would have no effect to anyone that wasn't growing anything. Conclusion. To argue that the law only applied to 1/12 of the people for only 2/7 of mankind's history on Earth would mean that there's a bunch of verses that you would have to ignore. Ignoring verses that clearly say something different to what you want them to say is like sticking your head in the sand, and kind of reveals that your heart may not be in the right place. And you may have a stiff neck, like the Bible puts it, not wanting to turn to the right or the left. We head towards God by following His ways, so if we're not following some of His ways, we are heading off in a slightly different direction, and if we continue in that direction, eventually we'll miss God altogether. Just something to think about. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. I pray that your faith grows, but more importantly, that it's shown through your life and your actions. Catch ya.